My name is Omar Al-Sayed. I am 54 years old, and for 30 years, my entire identity was built on the precision of my scholarship. On November 14th, 2024, I was in Dearborn, Michigan, preparing for a lecture at a local community center. The air that evening was that specific kind of Midwest cold, sharp, damp, and smelling of wet pavement. I remember adjusting my collar in the rearview mirror, checking the silver in my beard. I was a man of logic, a man of the book, and a man who believed he had mapped out the geography of the afterlife with academic certainty. I felt a slight pressure behind my left eye, nothing more than what I assumed was a tension headache from weeks of travel. I walked into the hall, greeted by the familiar hushed reverence of my students. We were discussing the nuances of jurisprudence, the rigid, beautiful structure of a life lived by rule. But as I stood at the podium, the fluorescent lights above me began to hum. It wasn't a sound. It was a vibration that settled in my teeth. I reached for my water glass, but my right hand didn't move. It sat on the lectern like a heavy, beige glove that didn't belong to me. I tried to speak, to tell them we were on page 42, but my tongue felt like a thick piece of dry velvet. The room tilted. I saw the faces of the men in the front row go from focused to terrified. I didn't fall so much as I drifted toward the floor. I remember the sensation of the carpet against my cheek. It was scratchy, smelling of industrial cleaner and old dust. I heard someone shout, "Call 911," but the voice sounded like it was being played through a radio submerged in water. I wasn't afraid. I was annoyed. I had 3 more points to make about the evening's text. Then, the blackness didn't just fall. It rose up from the floor and swallowed the room. The last thing I felt was the sharp, metallic tang of blood where I had bitten my tongue. And then, the silence was total. The transition wasn't a tunnel of light. It was a series of cold, clinical facts. I was hovering near the ceiling of Reese's room 3 at Beaumont Hospital. I could see the top of the crash cart, the messy piles of discarded plastic wrappers from the intubation kit, and the bald spot on the head of the attending physician. I watched them perform a bilateral thoracotomy. I heard the phrase acute aortic dissection mentioned with a flat, exhausted urgency. I saw the blood. It wasn't poetic. It was a dark, viscous puddle on the linoleum that a nurse kept slipping on as she reached for the monitor. Being out of my body felt like being a spectator at a play I had written but no longer understood. I looked at the man on the table, Omar, the scholar, and he looked small. His skin was the color of wet ash. I watched them use the paddles, saw my own chest heave upward in a violent, artificial arc thump. Silence. Thump. The monitor emitted a long, continuous beep that filled the room, a sound that should have been terrifying but felt as objective as a dial tone. I turned away from the scene, not because I couldn't watch, but because the room was dissolving. The walls of the hospital didn't disappear, they just stopped matching. I was standing in a space that felt like a vast, empty terminal at 3:00 a.m. It was quiet, grounded, and intensely lonely. I expected to see the scales of judgment I had spent 30 years describing to my congregation. I expected the angels of the grave to appear with their questions. Instead, there was only the sound of my own breathing, which was strange, because I knew for a fact that the lungs on the table below had stopped moving minutes ago. I was waiting for the trial to begin, but the courtroom was empty. The environment shifted. I wasn't in a cosmic void. I was standing in the hallway of my childhood home in Beirut, the one we left during the war. The peeling green paint was there, the smell of burnt coffee, the sound of a neighbor's radio. But the light was wrong. It didn't come from the windows. It seemed to be embedded in the air itself. At the end of the hallway, sitting on a simple wooden chair, was a man. He wasn't glowing with a blinding radiance that obscured his features. He was just there. He wore a plain, dark tunic, and his hands were folded in his lap. He looked like someone you would pass in a crowded market and instinctively want to ask for directions. But the weight of his presence was crushing. It was the physical sensation of a storm front moving in. As I walked toward him, the scholar in me tried to categorize this. I looked for the signs of the prophets I knew, the descriptions I had memorized. When I got within 5 feet, he looked up. His eyes weren't fire. They were something much more terrifying. They were recognition. He knew the secrets I had kept from my wife, the pride I felt when I was called Ustad, and the hollow spots in my heart where I had substituted ritual for love. "Omar," he said. The voice didn't echo. It was intimate. like he was speaking directly into my inner ear. "Who are you?" I asked, though my soul was already vibrating with an answer I wasn't allowed to give in my previous life. "I am the one you have taught others to bypass," he said. He stood up, and the hallway in Beirut began to crack. "I am Jesus, and we need to talk about what you have done with the truth." I felt a surge of defensive instinct, the scholar wanting to debate. But as he stepped closer, the air became so heavy I dropped to my knees. This wasn't a vision of peace. It was a confrontation. "I have followed the law," I said, my voice cracking against the floor of that hallucinated hallway. It was a reflex, the desperate plea of a man who had spent 54 years balancing a spiritual checkbook. I started reciting my credentials, the years of study in Cairo, the thousands of hours of prayer, the charity I had overseen in Detroit. I wanted to show him my ledger. I wanted him to see the math of my life. Jesus didn't interrupt me. He just stood there, his shadow stretching long and dark across the peeling green wallpaper of my childhood home. As I spoke, the wallpaper began to transform. The floral patterns turned into faces, people from my congregation, neighbors I had ignored, a beggar I had once scolded for standing too close to the mosque entrance. Their eyes were all fixed on me, not with anger, but with a hollow, hungry expectation. I realized then that my righteousness had been a performance for an audience of men, and the man standing before me saw right through the stagecraft. "You taught them how to wash their hands," he said, and his voice felt like a physical weight pressing on my shoulders. "But you never taught them how to lose their lives. You gave them a map of the desert, Omar, but you kept the water for yourself." He reached out and touched the wall, and the entire structure of the house began to groan and twist. The familiar smell of burnt coffee was replaced by the ozone scent of a coming storm. My chest, the one that was currently being cracked open by a surgeon's saw in Michigan, felt a phantom pang of agonizing pressure. I wasn't just losing my life. I was losing the version of myself I had spent decades polishing. The scholar was dying before the man did. Suddenly, the hallway vanished, and I was standing in my own living room in Dearborn. It was 3 weeks into the future. I saw my wife, Amina, sitting on our sofa. She looked older, her eyes rimmed with a red exhaustion I had never seen. Beside her sat my eldest son, Yusuf. They weren't mourning, they were arguing. On the coffee table lay my leather-bound journals and the titles to our property. "He left us with a name, Yusuf, but no peace," Amina whispered. Her voice was flat, drained of the warmth that had sustained our marriage for 30 years. She was holding my prayer beads, but she wasn't using them. She was twisting them until the string snapped. The wooden beads scattered across the hardwood floor like hail. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but my hand passed through her like smoke. This was the warning. Jesus was standing behind me, forcing me to watch the fallout of my holy life. I saw the bank statements. I saw the legal notices from the Islamic Center. My colleagues were already moving to replace me, questioning the financial allocations I had authorized. My reputation, the very thing I had prioritized over my family's emotional safety, was being dismantled by the same men I had called brothers. "You built a monument to your own understanding," Jesus said, "and now your family sits in its shadow, shivering." The financial loss was secondary to the look of betrayal on my son's face. He picked up one of my books, looked at the gold-embossed name on the cover, and threw it into the fireplace. The institutional respect I had craved was a vapor. I turned back to Jesus, my pride finally breaking into jagged pieces. "What do I do?" I screamed into the quiet of the room. "How do I fix what hasn't happened yet?" He stepped into the center of the room, and the image of my grieving family froze like a low-resolution video. The light shifted again, becoming sharp and clinical, echoing the hospital room I had left behind. He looked at me, and for the first time, the intensity of his gaze felt like an invitation rather than a judgment. "You ask how to fix it," he said, his voice resonating with a terrifying clarity. "The title of your life has been the scholar. It must become the servant. This is why I have stopped your heart today, to show you that the God you describe is not the God who is standing here. You have used my name as a footnote in your debates, but you do not know my face." He moved closer, his hand hovering over my chest. "The warning is this. If you return and continue to lead them toward a set of rules instead of toward me, the fracture you see in your home will become a divide that no prayer can bridge. You are being confronted because you have the ears of thousands, and you are leading them into a dry well. What determines the outcome is not your next lecture, but your next surrender. You must tell them that the law is a mirror to show their dirt, not a soap to wash it away. Only I am the water. I felt the heat from his hand. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a searing, physical burn that localized right over my sternum. I am sending you back to be a fool for my sake, he said. Your colleagues will turn. Your bank account will empty. Your title will be stripped. This is the price of the truth I am giving you. Do you accept the trade? I looked at the frozen image of my wife's tears and the broken beads on the floor. The choice wasn't between life and death. It was between my ego and the man in the dark tunic. The heat from his hand didn't dissipate. It localized into a singular, piercing point of pressure directly over my sternum. It felt like a branding iron made of pure sunlight. I looked down at his hand and saw not a glowing appendage of a celestial being, but the hand of a laborer, calloused, scarred, and real. The room in Dearborn began to blur at the edges, the walls stretching and pulling like salt water taffy, until the only thing left in the universe was the space between my eyes and his. I accept, I whispered. I didn't say it with the fervor of a convert in a movie. I said it with the hollowed-out resignation of a man who has realized his entire life's work was a house of cards. The moment the words left my mouth, the clinical silence of the afterlife was shattered by a sound so violent I thought my soul was being torn in half. It was the sound of a rib spreader, the mechanical crank of steel against bone, echoing from the hospital room I had forgotten. Jesus didn't disappear. He stepped back, and his expression shifted from a stern commander to something deeply, painfully empathetic. Your colleagues will call this a stroke, Omar, he said, his voice now competing with the rhythmic hiss-click of a ventilator. They will say your brain was starved of oxygen and conjured a story to comfort itself. They will offer you a seat at the head of the table again if you just keep quiet about what you saw here. If you choose their table, you lose your house. If you choose mine, you lose your name. He pointed toward a doorway that hadn't been there a second ago, a door that looked exactly like the heavy, swinging lead doors of a surgical theater. Go. The clock is starting again. The transition back into my body was a physical assault. It wasn't a gentle sliding into sleep. It was a head-on collision with a freight train. 1 second, I was in the presence of the Christ, and the next, I was choking on a plastic tube that felt like a garden hose shoved down my throat. The pain was absolute. My chest felt like it had been hit with a sledgehammer, and every breath was a localized explosion of agony. I heard the frantic, rhythmic chirping of monitors and the heavy thud of footsteps on tile. He's back. Sinus rhythm. We have a pulse. The voices were jagged and too loud. I tried to open my eyes, but the overhead surgical lights were like needles of ice. I felt the coldness of the four fluids pumping into my arm, the chemical sting of epinephrine coursing through my veins. My mind was a chaotic swirl of the green wallpaper in Beirut and the blood on the floor of the ER. I tried to lift my hand to touch my chest, to see if the burn from his hand was still there, but my arms were strapped down to the table. A nurse leaned over me, her face a mask of sweat and blue paper. Stay with us, Mr. Al-Sayed. You've had a massive cardiac event. Just breathe. I wanted to tell her that I hadn't been breathing for 20 minutes. I wanted to tell her that the Mr. Al-Sayed she was talking to was a ghost, a shell of the man who had walked into that lecture hall. I looked past her, toward the corner of the room, half expecting to see him still standing there in his dark tunic, watching the chaos. He wasn't there, but the air in the room felt different, heavy, charged, and expectant. I closed my eyes, and the darkness wasn't empty anymore. It was occupied. 3 days later, I was moved out of the ICU and into a private recovery room. The prestige of my position meant the hospital staff treated me like royalty, but the royalty felt like a shroud. My younger brother, Hassan, who is a prominent lawyer and a pillar of our community, sat by my bed. He was scrolling through his phone, his face tight with a tension he was trying to hide. He looked up and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile you give a dying man you're pretending is healthy. The board at the center is already planning a miracle return banquet, Omar, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They've raised $50,000 for your medical bills in 48 hours. The narrative is perfect. The scholar who was preserved by his devotion. You'll be more influential than ever. He reached over and patted my hand, his gold watch catching the dim afternoon light. Just don't mention the details you told the nurse when you first woke up. The hallucinations. We need to keep the focus on the strength of our tradition. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my brother. I saw a gatekeeper. I saw the institutional armor that Jesus had warned me about. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, not from the surgery, but a localized heat right where he had touched me. I pulled my hand away from Hassan. It wasn't a hallucination, Hassan, I said, my voice raspy from the intubation. I saw him, and he told me we've been lying. The silence that followed was more deafening than the monitors in the ICU. Hassan didn't argue. He didn't even look surprised. He just slowly stood up, tucked his phone into his pocket, and walked toward the door. "Get some rest, Omar," he said without looking back. "You're clearly still very confused." The silence Hassan left behind wasn't empty. It was heavy with the scent of a closing door. By the following Tuesday, the hospital room that had been overflowing with floral arrangements and fruit baskets from the Islamic Center began to thin out. The Miracle Return banquet was quietly postponed, then scrubbed from the digital calendar. I watched my phone. The same device that used to buzz incessantly with requests for fatwas and guidance grow cold. My colleagues didn't call. My students didn't text. It was a surgical social extraction, performed with the same clinical precision as my heart surgery. One afternoon, the dean of the institute, a man I had studied with in Al-Azhar, came to visit. He didn't sit down. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the gray Michigan sky, looking at the Ford bag as if it contained the answers to his discomfort. "Omar," he began, his voice practiced and soft. "We heard what you've been telling the nurses. And your brother. We understand the brain does strange things when the heart stops. Near-death experiences are a documented phenomenon of hypoxia." He finally turned to me, his eyes hard. "But you are a scholar of the law. To claim a private encounter with ISA that contradicts our foundations? It's not just a medical concern. It's a liability to the community's faith." I looked at him, and I didn't see a friend. I saw a man protecting a business. "I am not claiming a hallucination, Yusuf," I said, the heat in my chest flaring up again. "I am telling you that he is alive, and he is not a footnote. He told me we are leading people to a dry well." The dean's face didn't soften. It hardened into a mask of pity. "If that is your stance, Omar, then you cannot return to the podium. We have already redirected the medical fund to a special project. We'll cover your immediate costs, but the institute must distance itself from this episode." He left without a prayer. That evening, I checked my bank app. The balance hadn't changed, but the recurring scholar's stipend that had sustained my family for 20 years was marked as status terminated. I was discharged on a Friday, the day I should have been giving the sermon. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table in Dearborn, the house echoing with a silence that felt like a physical weight. Amina was in the kitchen, her back to me, the sound of her chopping vegetables rhythmic and aggressive. The financial fracture Jesus had shown me was no longer a vision. It was a stack of unpaid bills and a letter from the mortgage company that had arrived that morning. My son, Yusuf, walked through the room without looking at me, his headphones on, a literal wall of sound between us. "Amina," I said, my voice still thin. She stopped chopping but didn't turn around. "They've cut the stipend, and they've asked me not to come back to the center." She finally turned, her face pale, her eyes brimming with a mixture of fear and a burgeoning resentment. "So it's true," she whispered. "You're choosing this dream? You're throwing away 30 years of respect, our security, our son's tuition, for a vision you had while your brain was dying." She walked over and leaned on the table, her hands trembling. "Just tell them you were confused. Tell them the medication made you see things. One statement, Omar. That's all it takes to get our life back." I felt the brand on my chest, the literal physical scar from the surgery, but beneath it, the spiritual heat that had never left. I looked at the woman I loved, and I saw the choice Jesus had laid out. To choose his table was to lose my name. "I can't lie about him, Amina," I said. The look she gave me wasn't one of anger. It was the look of someone watching a stranger take over her husband's body. She didn't scream. She just picked up her car keys and walked out the back door. The sound of her car pulling out of the driveway was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I was alone in the house I had built on a foundation of RUL. And for the first time, the walls felt like they were made of glass. It has been 6 months since my heart stopped. I live in a small apartment now, 3 blocks away from the house I lost. My library is gone, sold to pay the remaining surgical bills that the institute refused to cover. I work part-time translating legal documents, a far cry from the podium. My son calls once a month. Amina hasn't spoken to me since the divorce was finalized in March. The world thinks I've had a breakdown, a tragic casualty of a high-stress career and a physical collapse. They see a man who lost everything. But there is one thing that anchors me, something I haven't told anyone because they wouldn't believe it. On the night I returned from the hospital, I looked in the mirror to inspect the surgical incision, the long, jagged purple line running down the center of my chest. There, right over the spot where the doctors had used the paddles, and where the man in the dark tunic had placed his hand, was something the surgeons couldn't explain. It wasn't a scar from a blade. It was a faint, white pigmentation in the shape of a handprint, perfectly etched into my skin, defying the natural healing process of the graft. This morning, I sat on a park bench, watching the snow begin to fall over Detroit. A young man, a former student of mine, walked by. He stopped, looked at my frayed coat, and then at my face. I saw the pity in his eyes, the look everyone gives the fallen scholar. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, Ustad," he said softly. I smiled at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to correct his grammar or quote a text. I felt the heat of the handprint beneath my shirt, a constant, low-grade warmth that keeps the Michigan winter at bay. "Don't be sorry," I told him. "I finally found the water." He walked away, shaking his head, and I sat there in the cold, a man with no name, watching the snow cover my shoes.